Okay, it is 10 o'clock, so I am going to get started. Hello and welcome to the webinar today. My name is Carrie Berger, and I'm the coordinator for the Northwest Fire Science Consortium. For those of you not familiar, the Northwest Fire Science Consortium is one of 15 fire science exchange networks across the country that is funded by the Joint Fire Science Program. So not only does the JFSP fund research, but they also fund science delivery. So part of our mission is to disseminate regionally relevant information to our stakeholders in Oregon and Washington. We try to do this by offering a diversity of opportunities for people to participate in, and hosting webinars like today is just one way we can accomplish that. So to learn more about the consortium or to sign up for a monthly newsletter, visit our webpage at northwestfirescience.org. To avoid any noise interference, I have muted your audio, so if you have a question, please type it into the chat box. Also, I will be recording the webinar and will archive it on our website and YouTube channel, and you can find both those web addresses in the chat window. So it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Chris Dunn. Chris is a research associate in the College of Forestry at Oregon State University. He spent 8 years in fire suppression and fuels management prior to pursuing research on contemporary fire effects and ecosystem response to mixed severity fires. Today, his research focuses on the safety and effectiveness of large fire management through collaborations with the Wildfire Risk Management Science Team of the Human Dimensions Program at the Rocky Mountain Research Station. This allows him to leverage his operational experience and research training to bridge the gap between science and management in an effort to better prepare land and fire managers for the changing fire environment. So Chris, welcome, and whenever you're ready, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Carrie, and thank you to all of you out there for giving me some of your time to present a lot of the work that I'm doing currently in collaboration, as Carrie just noted, primarily with the Rocky Mountain Research Station, and many of those names are listed here on this first slide. Our fearless leader, Dave Calkin, Matt Thompson, and then Kit O'Connor, and then from the Forest Service analytics side, Rick Stratton, and then our collaborators outside of university and the Forest Service, Joe Scott at Pyrologics and his staff, and their efforts with quantitative wildfire risk assessments. So much of what you'll see here was developed by others and myself and in our collaborations and discussions, and I'm here to do quite a bit of interpretation of how I view these new analytical tools in relation to wildfire management and aligning other of the activities on forest and land management in support of wildfire management specifically. And so I'll just start with a little bit of background. I think many of us probably recognize that we're somewhat stuck between two fire paradigms, if you will. You know, prior to Euro-American colonization, the Western U.S. The peoples of the Western U.S. had a different relationship with fire, used it more proactively for their management needs. And as populations increased, European populations particularly increased in the West, we saw this transition towards a more aggressive suppression, as you can see in the figure on the right, this being in particular following the Korean War, and we had all these new tools, and we were starting to employ these new tools or toys in force in support of fire suppression, and at the time, largely in support of timber management. Now, this transition wasn't without debate, and then it really followed the 1910 fires that were politicized by Gifford Pinchot and leveraged to establish the Forest Service itself. But at that time, around 1910 through 1920, there was significant debate as to the future direction and what we should do. And it's sort of interesting to look at that from a social-ecological perspective, because to me, it's really that interaction that drives the outcome, and a lot of that interaction really plays out through fire, whether it's intentionally lit fire or wildfires. But back in 1910, there was these debates going on in Sunset magazine, and you can see on the top this is how fires help forestry, the practical versus federal government's theoretical ideas. And this was really the perspective of the timber industry at the time. And they were in hopes that you could continue to burn at least the dry forest, and that would help protect the wetter forest where much of the timber activity was happening. But the Forest Service was pushing back at that time, as you can see in these articles that were being published and sunset and distributed out to the public all across, at least the Northwest, but down through California, so the Western United States. And they agreed, of course, let's figure out what this truth is. And ultimately, the Forest Service pushed that there was a fallacy in continuing that light burning program, and we transitioned into this aggressive suppression paradigm that has been prevalent all the way up to today. Now we recognize the need maybe to shift that and look for a new paradigm that can meet both ecological, social, economic, and fire management needs. But as we entered into this paradigm of aggressive suppression, and ultimately how we, developed our expectations of what we could get off the landscape, where we could live on our landscapes, we were largely supported by, I wouldn't necessarily call this a climate anomaly, but we did have cooler and wetter conditions. This is particular to Southwest Oregon, but this is indicative of at least much of the Northwest, if not all of the West. That during the 40s through the 80s, we really saw this increased moisture and decreased temperature. So the graph on the top would be, I know the scale bars are a little bit hard to see, is the amount of precipitation in millimeters on the y-axis, and then its time on the x-axis. It goes from 1895 to 2012. And that's the same x-axis on the bottom, but we're looking at temperatures. And you can see that there was this cool, wet period that prevailed through that period. And of course, as we've seen now coming out of the mid and late 80s, we've had this real increase in fire extent across much of our landscape, and this really leads us to recognize the role that climate plays in those conditions, and particularly climate, in this case, in the summer. And we continue to see evidence of this when looking at snowpacks. And so moisture in the winter here in Oregon across all basins. So by February 27th, we had above normal snowpacks, so a very wet winter. But simultaneously, we went into a very hot and dry summer. So similar to what we see in that previous graph that went through 2012. And of course, here in Oregon, we had a very significant fire season throughout 2017, including things like the Chetco Bar Fire and the Eagle Creek Fire up by Portland in the Gorge. And so it's becoming more and more evident that we can't even rely on recovery from winter conditions to dampen fire season in the future. And then in 2018, we had low snowpacks and another big fire season in Oregon, what has been attributed as the most expensive fire season recorded in Oregon to date. And so whether we get good snowpacks or we don't, we're still seeing significant fire because of these hot and dry summer conditions. And that, of course, interacts with all these other factors of wildland-urban interface expanding, and then the altered forest structure and fuel loadings that came from fire and forest management during that period when we had a different perception of what we could expect from our landscapes and that we could expect from our fire management communities. And so now we see longer fire seasons, increased summer droughts, and increasing losses across much of the West. At the same time that we're recognizing the significant and important role that fire plays ecologically and in support of many of our fire suppression needs. And so now we have this sort of idea that fire can be a problem, and we've certainly seen some devastating effects in recent times to communities. This being an image of Paradise, from the Paradise Fire, or Paradise, the town of Paradise that was lost to the Camp Fire last year in California. But a broader perspective of recognizing that fire also offers us this solution. And that is, it can prevent fire. It can prevent the increased accumulations of fuels. But in addition, it also plays this fundamental ecosystem role that we'd like to see established where that's feasible. And that has all these benefits on the social system as well. And so the National Cohesive Strategy really recognizes that, and it recognizes this idea that we need to learn to live with wildland fire. And that's this new social paradigm that we are trying to transition to. And it's our belief that data analytics and enterprise-wide risk management throughout the Forest Service and then expanding into other agencies can really support those efforts as we try to figure out what we can do and expect from our landscapes in the future. And so the cohesive strategy, this is the same mission statement, is really recognizing that fire-adapted or resilient communities are necessary. So there are needs and efforts that need to be pushed into that realm. That resilient ecosystems as well is something that we want to promote and try to establish, and often that's with fire and through fire, but it may entail thinning and other restoration treatments in support of that, and then safe and effective response. So it recognizes these three different, what we call subsystems within the broader social-ecological system, and you could take this into a Venn diagram and switch it and see that there is a social system, an ecological system, and a fire management system at play within this broader social ecological system. And it's my contention that it's, the fire management system, I guess twofold. One has been sort of ignored by researchers in its broadest sense. Ecological sciences has advanced pretty rapidly over the last several decades. And more recently, investigations into the social system and its dynamics has been propagated in the literature. And we're really pushing this fire management system as a critical need to round out all of these components. And I would contend that the fire management system itself sits really at the heart of this, at the center of this, because they really represent how fire is going to be impacting both of these other systems. That it's the managers and their efforts that lead to the either negative consequences or positive consequences that we see. And so the more we can bolster that system, the more likely we are to facilitate a good transition to a new paradigm that meets many of the needs. It's not going to meet everybody's needs, but at least for the broader communities or broader populace, we might be able to get there, and that we need to support our fire managers to help with that transition. And so what am I thinking about when I think about why we should increase analytics within wildfire planning? And it's because it can address near and long-term wildfire risk. So we're really directed at, and much of my research is directed at, improving the safety and effectiveness of wildfire response. It also has that we respond. So with these tools that I'm going to present, we can begin to respond in a way that is commensurate with the actual values at risk. That way, we're putting our responders in places with the greatest likelihood of success for good reasons. And then, of course, the efficient use of resources at national, regional, and local scales is becoming increasingly evident that we have resource shortages often late into the fire season when we reach these industrial, these national preparedness levels of 4 or 5, where we are dipping into the military often for support. And so if we can more efficiently allocate and use resources, we may be able to prevent some of those allocation decision issues. A big piece or a big component of this for me is that we align land management actions to support wildfire response. And this view really comes from the fact that fire is really becoming the agent of change on our landscapes. Timber was in the past. Of course, there's climate pressures and some other things, but fire is really that direct agent of change. And so we should align our other activities to support that as we try to manage the near-term risk and then eventually transition towards reduction of long-term risk. So how do we deal with the near-term need as well as this long-term need as we continue to make this transition? And these tools, I think, can help with that. And then improved shared governance in wildfire management. And I'll discuss what I mean by that and where those opportunities exist, but we can bring in stakeholder engagement. There are a lot of cross-jurisdictional management issues that need to be addressed, and then the tools you'll see can really aid with communication with stakeholders. And I think the maps and the other products that I show you later it'll be evident how that can really be bolstered. And I say shared governance. A lot of times you hear shared stewardship. I like to use shared responsibility within the wildfire context. I guess after all, sharing is caring. It's something I guess I'm trying to teach my 4-year-old twins while learning it myself. So this really is a perspective of how we can get to that broader shared stewardship, shared governance, shared responsibility perspective. And this isn't just, something that's been identified or known to us in our research group. The quadrennial fire review really brought it out. We see this in other research. And you can see here, even in the quadrennial, the number one with under performance measures, data analytics, and operational capability assessment is that we just don't have sufficient data right now. We lack sufficient fidelity and reliability of that information, and there are a lot of gaps. So it's difficult to even assess and understand how our fire programs are operating and whether they're being successful or whether resources are being used to their most efficient capabilities. Some of this that they're noting is even deeper. It's going to be a deeper dive than what I'm going to get into today, and deeper need than what I'm going to get into today. We are laying the foundation for beginning this whole analytic program that supports large wildfire management, or even initial attack on through large fire management. And it's going to take a long and concerted effort to get there, and a cultural change within the agencies towards decision-making focused on using analytics to support their experiences that they bring to the table as well. All right, and so that gives you just a little background and sort of how I think about the problem, just so you know where I'm coming from. We're going to transition to the tools and really get into the nitty-gritty of what these tools are, and then how I see them being applicable to a variety of land management needs. And before I do that, I'm going to go ahead and play a short whiteboard video that really summarizes this process within a couple minutes, and then we'll get into it much deeper shortly.
Welcome back to the Ponderosa Pine National Forest, where staff are working together with the Wildfire Risk Management Science Team to create more proactive wildfire risk management plans. One of the challenges of spatial fire planning is identifying control locations where operations can be safer and have a higher likelihood of success. This is especially important because control opportunities often don't align with ownership boundaries. With a plan in mind ahead of time, everyone involved can be clear on the best actions to take, even in a cross-boundary fire. The science team brings several tools to the table for this effort. The basic ingredients of these tools are intuitive and designed to complement local expertise and judgment. Quantitative wildfire risk assessments, Suppression Difficulty Index, and potential control locations that help form potential wildfire operational delineations, also known as PODs. The quantitative risk assessment uses fire modeling and expert analysis to estimate benefits and losses from fire. Suppression Difficulty Index provides an assessment of the potential hazards and opportunities for fire responders by balancing expected fire behavior with access and mobility. The Atlas of Potential Control Locations maps local conditions where fire lines have and have not been effective in the past, and provides a measure of operational opportunities and challenges for suppression. By overlaying suppression difficulty and potential control locations on a map of quantitative wildfire risk, we develop pods that summarize risks to important values while highlighting opportunities to effectively engage fire. The science team is already deploying these tools in planning applications on National Forest System lands across the western United States, including for real-time decision support on dozens of large fires. Incident management teams use these tools to prioritize responder safety and assess suppression opportunities on fire operations. And forest managers and their neighbors, like here on the Ponderosa, use these tools to integrate fire into landscape planning, prioritize fuel treatments, and create or improve control opportunities to reduce risk to things they value. Can the wildfire risk management science team help with assessment and response planning in your area? Contact us to find out how we can help your forest and neighbors plan for the next fire.
At a very basic level, plants use photosynthesis to capture.
There's your ecology lecture for the day. So back to the tools. That was a quick summary, and I'm going to give you a little more detail about what those are, and then again, as I said, look at some of their utility, how they've been used, how we think they can be used in the future. And we're really going to focus on these potential control location atlases. So if you hear me say PCLs, we're really talking about the assessment of where fire boundaries have stopped in the past and where they're likely to in the future based on some underlying landscape features, built or natural. Quantitative wildfire risk assessment, so I'll mention that, and this is really Rick Stratton and Joe Scott's wheelhouse. But I'll describe that process and where I think there can be some shared governance opportunities and opportunities to engage with stakeholders. And then Suppression Difficulty Index, which comes from a researcher and an incident commander out of Spain who developed this process that works well for them, and it actually works really well for our landscapes here in the western U.S. And so potential control location atlases. So how do we develop these? And this comes from Kit O'Connor's 2017 publication, which I have a list at the end that can direct you to that much more directly than I can. But he did this assessment, and then we've employed it much greater extent here in Oregon and elsewhere. But what we do is we take these measured landscape features and these compound fire indices that you see the list on the left. We create spatial data layers across a landscape that has relatively contiguous and similar sort of forest and field structure type and mountainous terrain or non-mountainous terrain. So similar terrain, similar vegetation types, similar field types, so that we are sort of limiting that scope of it, and you have to just add more and more of these models together, but you want a model really specific to the localized conditions, and we build that off of local fire history. And so here is the fire perimeters in this area that is southern Idaho, northern Nevada. And so what we do is we have all these spatial data layers underlying it, and we sample those fire perimeters. So we're looking at what was successful to control these large fires, and these fire perimeters come from the MTBS data set, so they're large fires over 1,000 acres or greater here in the western United States. And so we sample all that, and then we're able to place that into a statistical model and predict back to the landscape to fill in the gaps where fires have not occurred and assess the quality of the features for future control or containment of large wildland fires. And that's topography, slope, these field types, the road infrastructure that exists, the natural barriers, we developed this, use Greg Dillon's resistance to control metric, which is really related to the fuel models and fuel transition, so we can capture that rate of spread coming out of FLAM map, that suppression difficulty index that I'll explain here in a minute, also feeds this, and then travel costs, really the accessibility for personnel and equipment on the landscape built off of road systems. And all those feed what is a boosted regression tree model. So it's a machine learning algorithm that uses classification regression trees, and then through its sampling methods and its subsampling methods, it goes through this machine learning algorithm and averages all of the effect size of each of those covariates, and then rates them. As you can see here for the Willamette National Forest, it can rate them as to their relative influence on what ultimately were historical fire perimeters, and then therefore what we might use in the future for the next fire event. And you can see an AUC score of 0.78, and what that essentially says is it gives you sort of an assessment of the accuracy of these predictions, and if you multiply it by 100, you get a percent out of that. And so we're really looking at 75 to maybe 85% accurate on capturing what features are used to contain a fire at those perimeters, which is really exceptional, I would say, in from a statistics perspective. It's really strong and good, and we should expect that there is some additional error out there because opportunities do present themselves to the firefighters and fire managers out there to catch fires in otherwise less substantial or effective fire lines. So you can catch it using features that may not be the best, but the opportunity doesn't present itself. And that sort of contributes to that error, as well as some of the geospatial error that is inherent in that. We don't need to get into those details, just so you know that, any more details of that. But that's how we assess that. And then when we have those models built, we can predict back to the landscape. All right, so taking it another step, at one of these tools, we're looking at the QRA, or the Quantitative Wildfire Risk Assessment. So Region 6 had one for all lands, built by Joe Scott and Rich Stratton, or via Rich Stratton. And so we have most of Region 6, Oregon and Washington, covered by this, with some small holes where there wasn't available data. So it's not fully wall-to-wall, but it's pretty close, and it certainly covers the forest lands of Region 6. And then these do exist in many parts of the western United States, as do these efforts. Kit O'Connor has covered much of the Southwest, much of Region 3 at this point, or will this spring before fire season, doing the same process that I'm doing here for Region 6. And so a little bit about the Quantitative Wildfire Risk Assessment. The first input here in the upper left of this figure is maps of the highly valued resources and assets. So there needs to be a determination of those resources or assets that are valued by the agency or their stakeholders, and then those need to be spatially mapped. They then use FSIM to simulate what is equivalent to 10,000 years of fire simulation. So using point ignition density maps, and then using FSIM and historical weather streams that it randomly draws and utilizes, will simulate fires for 10,000 years. And that gives you an assessment of which pixels or points on the landscape are most likely to be impacted. And so you basically sum up the number of times that a pixel experiences a fire and then divide by the 10,000 years, and that gives you a burn probability, which is particularly useful on a relative scale to see where those areas are that are likely to burn versus those that have a lower probability. And so that fills out one component of wildfire risk. It also generates these fire intensity or flame length maps that can be used to address how fire impacts those highly valued resources and assets that were identified and spatially mapped in the previous step. And this is where expert judgment really plays a critical role and an opportunity for shared governance, either through other agencies or stakeholders that an agency may want at the table. And there's two real important processes here that are identified on the right, and that is, how does an individual resource respond to the distribution of fire intensities expected? So from fire intensity level 1, so the lower fire intensity, do you see positive change from that fire? Scaling on down to when you have a very intense fire, do you see negative changes? And the shape of this trend line will change depending on the resource that is being investigated or of interest. And so then you have a suite of response functions for a suite of highly valued resources and assets. Then those have to be rated relative to each other so that they are placed on a scale that can be comparable. And that's what sums up to the conditional net value change, or the CNVC that you see in the title. And so you have one value and expected loss or response function for timber, we'll say, and maybe one for spotted owl habitat, just to cheer on Region 6 problems. And so you have to rate those. Is spotted owl habitat on equal footing as timber? Is timber on equal footing, or is there some relative difference between those two? And then we can sum all of those up together into a single value and create maps that show, when considering fire effects on the multiple values that we see across our landscapes, what is the overall positive to negative impacts that would be expected from a fire that burned within that location. And that really gives us the underlying risk assessment broadly across the landscape. And you can have multiple maps rating out different levels if desired. All right, so the next step then, and the last tool that I want to show, is the Suppression Difficulty Index. And it's a very intuitive index, at least from a firefighter perspective, in that you're really rating the fire behavior. This comes out of FlamMap, just as it does for the potential control location, divided by more or less the ease of access across the landscape. And you can see this image here for a wildfire, how it plays out on the landscape. As you move away from these large road systems and up steep slopes, it gets much more difficult to operate in those landscapes versus being down here on the flat. And it really begins to stratify your landscape into a more or less relative responder exposure index to fire. How dangerous or difficult might it be to operate in those environments, which is particularly important for initial attack judgment calls, as well as where you're going to place your fire line and those resources that you have on the ground, supporting your efforts to manage the wildfire. And so you can begin to really plan ahead and think about your wildfire response and what you're willing to do with your resources on the landscape. So we're going to continue to see images of these, but related to all three of these tools, but they'll be related to a specific purpose and to a specific landscape so that they are comparable when you try to ingest all three of these underlying analytical tools for use for various activities. And I want to start with informing the wildfire response. This is really where we began combining these tools together. For the purpose that we employed these tools for was to inform strategic and tactical response. This comes out largely as a pre-planning tool, but through the risk management assistance team out of the Washington office, these products, at least over the last 2 years, last year being, of course, a ramp up, we deliver these directly to incidents as decision support tools. And we'll continue to do so this summer as well, so that they can make better risk-informed decisions. And you'll see how that can play out. the first, the question that often comes up when you have ignitions, a lightning bust, and is what you should do with that ignition. And that's really the strategy of how you want to deal with that fire. Right now, the agencies tend to just default to an aggressive suppression strategy for many reasons. Some justifiable, others maybe just an inherent bias that we have already built from our experiences. And so we want to set new strategies, new ways to think about strategies really founded in wildfire risk. And we leverage that quantitative risk assessment to assess risk, in particular the conditional net value change layer. So what we expect when looking at all of our valued resources and assets, what we expect the consequences of fire on the landscape to be. And that really informs whether we should manage that fire for resource benefits or continue or go into an aggressive suppression response to protect these highly valued resources and assets. And both of those are relevant strategies and objectives for fire management and land management in today's wildfire environment. And so let me describe this process really quick. The upper left corner here is the potential control location atlas. It's probability-based. So blue, higher probability that feature would be used as a containment line for a large fire. Red being on the opposite end, that it's got a very low probability that it has been used and would be used, therefore, in the future to contain a large fire. I simply pulled out in B, panel B here, those control locations that had a probability higher than 0.5, so the upper distribution of those. And you can see that in so doing, they form these natural polygons start to develop across the landscape. And we can leverage that to make what we call pods, or potential wildfire operational delineations. And this is a common terminology that is out there now, are these planning pods. Sometimes you hear response pods, but in this case, really focused on planning pods. Once those are digitized, we can overlay them over that quantitative risk assessment. This is that conditional net value change layer. And here I just took the average of the conditions internal of those polygons to summarize conditional risk, or the conditional net value change. So what we expect, either positive or negative, from a fire. And you can see that the green ones then are where fire is more likely to provide positive benefits than negative, versus the red where we see the opposite trend. And this really begins to identify areas on the landscape based in this expert and analytic approach, and expert judgment analytic approach combined as to how we might respond to an ignition within that landscape. And so in this case, if it's green and you're expecting positive benefits, then your default response shouldn't be just aggressive suppression. You should at least have that pause and say, well, we expect positive benefits, therefore maybe we need to pursue an alternative strategy to aggressive suppression and provide that benefit to that landscape, versus one of these other pods where there's maybe too many assets or a community nearby that warrant aggressive suppression without much consideration. And so that develops that strategic response, how we want to pursue with that ignition. But it's not, and this is played out in particularly the Tonto National Forest, which was one of the early examples of adopting this new spatial or strategic fire planning that I'm describing now. And so you can see here the Tonto National Forest and their categorization of those pods. So we summarized risk, and then you have to work with the agencies to determine how you want to categorize these into a strategic response, how you want that default strategy to be set. It's not meaning that you have to pursue that strategy, because conditions are dynamic every year, but it sets a default so that you at least have pause and you're considering your actions before engaging. And we can see their colors. And so they have protect, where HVREs are high risk, and so from unwanted wildfires. The restore, where there's a moderate risk, you may be able to use fire, you may not. maintain where there's likely to be positive benefits. And then the Tonto had to go to an exclude because they have non-fire adapted ecosystems where with some invasive species that really put them at risk from wildfire. And wildfire didn't play an important role in their historical developments. And then they had to develop this one high complexity class, which is the orange one here in the center, just because of the conditions that were presented there and the challenges. So they decided they couldn't summarize it into one of these other categories and created another one. And then they had 3 fires, A, B, and C here. I'm going to really focus on just a couple of these. This A was up here in the wilderness, which is the Brooklyn Wilderness Fire. B was the Highline Wooey Fire, and then C was the Pinal Fire, which was in the restore, where fire may or may not play have positive benefits on the landscape. And we'll start there. We'll really look at the Pinal Fire. This was a great example of utilizing these products effectively. And you can see here that they essentially managed the fire to the pod boundary. I think the original pod did come out and around a little bit farther, but they leveraged much of that boundary. They recognized that fire can play a good role under the right conditions in this landscape, and they pursued that strategy effectively, deviating a little bit here up onto a ridge line instead of this mid-slope road, which makes perfect sense from a firefighting perspective, that you would leverage that. And they were able to effectively use that strategy to gain resource benefits because of the fire weather conditions that presented themselves when they had an ignition. And having that predefined strategy allowed them to think through a different process than aggressive suppression much more effectively. And since the pod boundary leveraged good control locations, they could easily just move to those conditions and leverage that event to meet their resource objectives. But we also have cases where we're looking at up here in these red pods, so we're in this full protect mode, and these are doing this process is also highly relevant to those conditions where you want to protect the community from a fire that's spilling out here. The pod boundary, again, was delineated on a strong control location. They were able to utilize that and then look internally, and you could base this off of those potential control location atlases to look internally to those the next best control locations within that pod. Since you don't want fire there, and you were not successful at initial attack, this offers an opportunity then to leverage a pod boundary and move to internal potential control locations and suppress the fire at the next opportunity that presents itself. So it's pretty effective down there in the Pinal Fire, and there's been some stories out about that that you'll see at the end of my presentation that you can access in wildfire management today. Okay, now, as I mentioned, we do send these products to incident teams when they're managing a large fire incident. It's not every single one, but we try to do so. It sort of depends on the forest requesting this assistance. And so I just want to show you an example of fire spread relative to potential control location atlas on the left and suppression difficulty on the right, the PCL map in particular in this case on the Watson fire from last year. They did receive these products not before the initial strategy was pursued. So this is actually sort of a look back in relation to our PCL maps, but they did use them for contingency planning, looking out if the fire did get across where they hoped to control it, what were their next opportunities. And it looked pretty bleak going up into the Gerhardt Wilderness, I believe. But they were successful in their efforts. And I want you just to pay attention to what we can see both in the progression maps and in relation to these two data products, these two analytical products that we share. And I'll just step you through it. And I put some words up here on some obvious burnouts that you can see coming out along many of these really strong potential control locations. There happen to be some pretty good, this one I like. You can see looking down in here that that's a reasonable line to attempt, but it's not a high probability line. And so you can think about allocating additional resources or needs there, or whether you can reinforce that line in time to contain that fire. And it's not always possible, and this can highlight some of those critical areas of concern. It wasn't successful there, but there was a large fuel break that had been developed a long time ago here that they could leverage for burnout and wrap this fire up. And as you can see in the end, the PCLs did pretty good at addressing where they were likely to catch this fire. And so these tools can be used to forecast many of those efforts and begin to build those, whether you're building your primary or your alternative or your contingent line in the PACE model. These tools can really help highlight and identify those for you in the future. And then I put this in here. So this is the Taylor Creek fire. The Klondike fire here is in the white, and they did burn together, and it's not surprising that they did. But I'm really looking at this Taylor Creek fire, and then there's this internal older fire. I think it's from 2014, maybe it's 2010. I'll have to look that up if anybody is concerned with it. And you can see they were successful at catching that in the past. But we sent this to the Klondike and the Taylor Creek fire, and they had these tools. I'm not sure that they were integrated, but if we look back, we can see that the ignition was somewhere down here, and we can look across this landscape and see that there are limited control opportunities. This is really difficult terrain. This Merlin's over here and Grants Pass down here for those of you that aren't familiar with it and then are familiar with Oregon. So there's a community over here that needed protected. But you look across this landscape, there's limited control opportunities. And if you look at the Suppression Difficulty Index, it also highlights the challenges of operating in this environment. Sometimes you can be successful at what now looks like a small fire, but once was a large fire. But still, you look at this, and at the time of this fire burning, this map here is very red, and it can be used to forecast the challenges that are presented to the fire managers. And maybe this is a good communication tool with outside stakeholders as to what they're up against in trying to control this fire. And ultimately, they did bring it out to reasonable potential control locations as assessed by our analytical tools. It really highlights where they could be caught. And, I think they had some pretty good luck up in this region here and did well and still attempted to catch it at the best locations that they could, but they were obviously challenged. And at the same time, there were high values at risk. So here's the community off here down in the bottom right corner, and of course some internal highly valued resources and assets, particularly old growth forests and old growth structures that support the endangered species spotted owl. And I think that's really what highlights this. And so you can really use this as this forecasting tool, how difficult it's going to be. We can target mitigation. I'm going to speed up a little here because I'm probably running out of time. And when I think about that, I'm really thinking about where, when, why, and who needs to be engaged in that. I actually showed this image earlier, and so the fire was burning here, and this cabin was saved. But so do you need to mitigate by working with the homeowners so that they are more resilient to a fire that will burn adjacent to their landscape, or do we need to more broadly mitigate the adjacent landscape with fuels treatments? And we can really start to highlight those with these tools. At a broad scale, we can use the underlying quantitative risk assessment in this fashion, where you're looking at the probability of fire occurrence, again, as I described from the quantitative risk assessment, how many times those pixels are impacted by a fire in the fire simulation. And then you can rate them out based on the number of housing units and their burn probability here. And you can start to highlight Bend or Medford or Grants Pass and the sort as some communities that are likely at risk. And we can also turn that into the source, where the source of those fires that are likely to impact those communities. And this is a density map that shows where fire ignitions are likely to get large, or if they did get large, where they would impact a community. And of course, the closer you are, those are the more likely to impact those communities. And so a lot of this this highlights that a lot of this risk to these communities is not from deep in the Forest Service or wilderness lands, it's actually the adjacent lands. Not that it's not possible for something to come raging out of the forest, but it really helps target where you might engage with other stakeholders and landowner entities to protect these communities. And this is work by Joe Scott and Rick Stratton that I'm just demonstrating here for that sort of broad scale, where we want to target our mitigation activities to protect these communities in this case. And then we can sort of, as we begin to build these tools out and build these potential operational delineations out, we can start to highlight areas at a much more refined scale. In this case, this is a jurisdictional boundary, the Forest Service boundary on the Rogue. So this is the Rogue River National Forest over here that's combined with Situ, but this is up in the Cascades. And you can see that there's very little opportunity to catch a large fire if it was moving from east to west, coming out of here, coming off the forest at the forest boundary. It doesn't present itself as a good control location, and so the likely place they're going to catch it, if it did make it this far, is over here on private land. But that too, I picked here, this is just an example, and I picked the best line I could through this based on the PCL map and attempting to protect many of these, so this is this line here, protecting many of these highly valued resources and assets over here on private land. And it still is not a very good line, and so this highlights an opportunity to reinforce that boundary through other programs in anticipation that the fire will occur there at some point and protection will be needed, and we need a good line to do so. Again, forecasting suppression effectiveness. When you see a landscape like this, you can assess your operational capabilities, and this would be similarly relevant to any land management activities and the challenges presented therein. And so there aren't a lot of good opportunities, and so your targeted mitigation activities might be focused on, adapting the community to be more fire resilient itself, having evacuation plans and the sort, and then maybe treating the landscape where you can, so you provide a concerted front to protect those structures and those communities. But this played out just as you would expect based on these maps into a large fire that had limited response control capabilities. And then thirdly, another example, this is Ashland, Oregon, down by the border of Oregon and California, interior in the Rogue Valley. And we can see here again, PCL, Suppression Difficulty Index, and the QRA. When I look at this Forest Service boundary, I too see limited opportunities to catch it right at that boundary. There might be some opportunities in here on some of these road systems, but it also highlights the importance of cross-boundary collaboration projects. Daniel Lavelle with OSU Extension has really found some great ways to engage and develop a process to work with private landowners that links up really well with our efforts here. And this would be a case where, particularly here, and I know that the community of Ashland is working with this landowner in particular to try to address the difficulties of controlling a fire if it came out of this watershed and pushed towards town, where there are homes and other assets at risk. And you can see that play out in these three maps, right? So PCL, SDI, and the quantitative risk assessment. So lots of values at risk, a lot of difficulty on the private side of this fence relative to the Forest Service side, probably because of a lot of the activities that they've already conducted with support from the Nature Conservancy and their collaborations down there to really address this problem for Ashland specifically. And then back to this shared responsibility perspective, this is, here's Grants Pass, but this is a common, land ownership pattern that we see in Southwest Oregon, where it's checkerboarded largely with BLM. And if we were to draw a pod boundary, so a potential operational delineation boundary here, it would likely follow this potential control location that's strong down here. And then we would look internal to summarize that risk and then say, try to make decisions on what we can do with that. But this again is, there's limited opportunities to control here. There is really challenging ground to operate on, so firefighters are going to have challenges. And there's a lot of values at risk. So clearly this is going to be one of those protect pods, if you will, and aggressive suppression is going to remain the primary response. But as we've seen over the years, we continue to lose large fires primarily because of the climate and weather picture that occurs at that time, sometimes in the lack of resources because of the abundance of ignitions that push through this region every year, often in July with these big lightning busts. And so you can really start to have conversations with the private landowners out here, which I think in this case is largely timber driven, so industrial forestry, and their contribution to the risk of Grants Pass. Now, whether they will change their management activities is unknown, and whether we can even do a lot of mitigation activities here on much of the BLM land is in question because of the difficult terrain that exists here. And so you can begin to highlight these areas and have those conversations with the community of Grants Pass and the landowners that have ranches in here, up some of these valleys, on what we might do in the event that a large fire occurs. And these underlying analytical tools can really highlight those for those landscapes. And so I bring this map back up. We're getting close, so if you need to leave, I understand, but you can hold on for a few minutes. I will finish, and then, like I said, I'll stay on late. This is the area that we have covered with the potential control locations and the Suppression Difficulty Index here in Region 6. The red is the fire history that was used to develop each of these individual models that have been mosaicked together and created for Region 6 in a sense. And then the quantitative risk assessment covers pretty much wall-to-wall, minus some gaps that exist internally in here, I believe, and some other places where the data just wasn't available. And we're working with many of these Forest Service offices to facilitate the development of pods using their local knowledge with these analytical tools and begin this shift towards integrating these analytics. So I wanted to leave you a couple things. This is a summary from that Matt Thompson put together, talking about, in his sort of literature review and work with MIT and going through the Harvard Business Review and looking at how organizations use analytics to support their efficiencies. And you see that adopting analytics can be managerial and cultural. The data-driven cultural change is necessary. So it's not just about the ability to make these maps, which we're creating right now. It's also about the internal culture of the agencies to begin to use them as a foundation to their decision-making process. So it's as much an analytics problem as it is a people problem in making this transition. So while we're talking about cultural change as a society as a whole and learning to live with fire, there's also a need for cultural change towards adoption of analytics within the fire management agency itself. And a bit of a move from this gut and intuition, which is important to maintain in the fire community, but we need to integrate that with analytics, and I think we will have far better outcomes when we do so. And so part of the solution now to dealing with this fire problem that we have, fire that we want more fire in some places, we want less fire in other places, is really placed in this eye towards long-term risk reduction, and these products can help get us there. We can engage with multiple stakeholders at the front for those values that we place on our landscapes. And then, of course, when we have these products, we can then go back to the stakeholders and discuss those needs for cross-boundary projects through good neighbor authority and otherwise. Really getting at shared responsibility co-management. And it does provide an exceptional communication tool. I think when you can put up some of the scenarios that I demonstrated, you really effectively are communicating with the public and other stakeholders on the challenges that are inherent in these fire operations. I don't want to say it's a substitute for local or experiential knowledge, but and so we really want them to marry up. They're complementary, they support each other, and our engagement thus far with these tools is that it is intuitive to what a lot of the either gut or experiential learning that has occurred within the fire organization. And then these aren't set decisions, but they're decision tools. And so they will help the decision process. But they're not intended to be, this is what you will do. And with that, I took up the whole hour. These are just additional resources that I put in here. You can either take a picture or copy them now. I can share this this presentation with you in PDF form or otherwise, or you can come back to the video and look at them. But these are some other good pieces of information along with this talk that I just gave. And with that, I'll take questions or hang out for 15, 20 more minutes if you want to have a conversation post our hour.
Great. Thank you so much, Chris. That was really wonderful. A lot of information there. And for those folks that have to leave right at 11, I want to share with you that I did post, well, like Chris said, he will be available for the next 15 minutes, but if you have to go, his email address has been posted as well. This video has been recorded, and he has offered to share a PDF version of this. We have questions right out of the gate, so I'm just going to dive in. And also for those folks leaving us right at 11, I do want to say that Rick Stratton is also doing a webinar, and that's on April 24th at 10 a.m. So subscribe to our newsletter to get notification of that webinar, or check back at our website, but I hope you can join us for that one as well. So I'm just going to dive right in here. There's been some questions along the way, and one in particular was, how closely do the pods follow the hydraulic unit codes?
Well, I've never done a direct comparison of that. In the original set was primarily, that came out of the Southern Sierras, was primarily derived along hydrologic units, and then modified to some degree with large roads and some rivers. And so they just used, mostly watershed boundaries. I've found in looking at least Region 6 that roads play a much, like larger roads, if they're ridge roads, that's great, but even valley roads and sometimes mid-slope roads play a larger role in containing these past large fires. They're easier to operate from, the sort. And so just using the HUC boundary would force these boundaries up onto ridges, and surprisingly, those ridges aren't used as effectively on large fires as one intuitively might think. And so it appears, as we develop these based off PCLs, that it will not follow the HUC boundaries much.
Okay, thank you for that. And then, is there a way to inform the SDI and QRA with weather, as weather often has an overly large influence on landscape conditions and fire behavior characteristics?
So SDI, so I'll start with the QRA. The QRA uses historical weather streams and uses 10,000 years of simulation to get to the estimates that it does. So it integrates that using what is akin to FS Pro modeling simulations or Farsight and on down the road to, behave ultimately. So we're really building off of foundational equations for fire behavior. It's just whether you have dynamic weather streams or not. And so weather is in there in the QRA, and you can actually use a distribution of the fire intensity that comes out from the distribution of the fires that impacted a certain area. And so it's in there inherently, but ultimately what we're showing with CNVC is the most common or average condition. Now, you can ramp that up if you want to, or bring that down with the same data, and it's available in the package from the QRA to look at, well, we have weather today, and we could actually shift some of these pod colorations seasonally or annually based on that. So it's in there. And then SDI it does use fire weather in its fire behavior simulation. So we use FlamMap to estimate the fire intensity and flame lengths that come out of that. And so it's inherent in there. And when we're sending it to incidents, we're pulling the weather streams or the weather conditions that the analyst on site is using for their FS Pro runs. And so it's consistent with that condition that they're dealing with at that time. The SDI that I've used here and demonstrated here is based on 90th percentile.
Okay. So Chris, how many years is an old fire scar usable as a potential control?
Oh, that is a good question. Research by Sean Parks, Brandon Collins, I think show a reduced fire effect maybe up to 9 years. But that doesn't mean that that isn't necessarily reflective of it being good for fire control. So certainly for those first 3 years, you're going to get limited fire spread in there, and it's really dependent on the ecosystem whether you get a herbaceous response that's continuous and can support fire versus a shrub response and how quickly those develop. But I think I would be comfortable with up to 3 years saying it's going to be, that fire is going to prevent spread, but you're going to have a reinforced line that was used to contain that fire. And so if that reinforced line from the fire operations of the previous fire is maintained, then you could retain that fire line itself in perpetuity if so desired, and gain the benefits of that the initial efforts for fire containment. So it's sort of a mix of the two. Yeah, the fuel structure will eventually come where you can't just let the fire burn into it and be safe and comfortable that it's going to go out, but you do have that opportunity to leverage the past fire lines for future benefits. Hopefully that answers it well.
Yeah, and I'm sorry, I was reading other questions as you were answering, but she also asked what sort of ground truthing is needed to support the planning. I'm not sure you covered that.
So the pre-planning portion, when we draw these, when we go to the agencies, and I just finished, no, I'm not finished, but I just had an initial workshop with the Umpqua earlier this week, the Umpqua National Forest here in Oregon. We bring fire staff in, and they are the ones that begin to draw these boundaries. And so, yes, we give them these analytical tools to support their efforts, but they are really bringing their local knowledge to the table in drawing those boundaries. And so it is somewhat ground truth in that way. And then they also highlight areas where they need to go in ground truth because they have concerns. They're not certain. And ideally will do that sometime prior to fire seasons. So we think that should be done, but I think in many cases people are already bringing that to the table when we're developing these, and so it just may be focused on certain smaller areas because that local knowledge is already so strong by the fire staff.
Mm-hmm. So is that are the observed benefits that are achieved from those prior fires incorporated in modeling potential benefit in the QRA?
So the QRA that's here for Region 6 takes captured fires up through 2017, and they do this fuel succession process, which is a step through the fuel models that we have in existence. And so when I modify a 1-year-old fire, I just bring it down to its lowest fuel loading for that class. If it's a grass class, down to its lowest. If it's a timber type, down to its lowest. And that's how it becomes represented in the fire, in the Suppression Difficulty Index in particular. And so depending on how you want to step through that fuel succession piece will determine how it plays out in the model. And there is limited scientific information on how that successional process occurs and relates to these fuel models that we have in existence that feed our fire behavior models. So there's some limitation there. But with the local experts, hopefully you can find a way to step through those correctly and see how that plays out. And you could, in that one example of the Taylor Creek fire, it had a small fire footprint in the center that I believe it's 5 years old, if I'm correct, and it shows up starkly as still a good place, or I guess a low SDI, so a reasonable place to operate. And that's because the fire behavior was still low. So the process of stepping through those field models held out through 5 years in that case. And that's something that Pyrologics has a process for addressing. Now in the potential control locations model, it's less sensitive to a single fire event or a recent fire event, except in areas where we can sample and integrate these fires butting up against each other. There's not a lot right now of fires that have burned together. There's examples out there, but in the grander scheme of things, that hasn't happened a lot. There isn't a lot of fire-on-fire interaction or reburn yet. Of course, that's going to become more prevalent. Kit O'Connor has developed a process for integrating that into our potential control location models, but it's a little bit tricky because sometimes it overrides the entire model and becomes the only thing that matters, which is sort of interesting. Then you need fire to ever stop fire. Nothing else works, which isn't that reflective of reality, but is certainly reflective of how fire helps with that reality. And so we're still trying to work through that on how best to address that and get it into our models so that we can demonstrate the benefits of recent fire events. Strong in SDI. It does show up in the QRA primarily from a fire behavior perspective, as you have reduced fire behavior and therefore reduced fire effects. And then when you have those response functions, the value that comes out of that is commensurate with those reduced fire effects. And then so it's less sensitive in PCL, but really high in SDI and those others.
Okay. So
hopefully that answers.
Yeah, I think it did. Are these spatial fire planning tools being incorporated to the Wildland Fire Decision Support System and IFTDIS or IFTDIS?
Not that I'm aware of in IFTDIS, so not in there. I think that would be a great place for it to be targeted. And I'm not sure that it's really been uploaded into WFDIS. I think any individual forest could do that within the Wildland Fire Decision Support System if they so chose to, especially if this forms the foundation of their new spatial fire plan as we move away from the fire management plans of old. And so they could be loaded up and utilized in that fashion. And I think many of the forests hope to do that. But that would only be the polygon data because the decision support system can't handle the finer scale raster data, the underlying analytical models that I showed you in here. If we summarize them to pods, that could be loaded in WFDIS, but the other data layers, WFDIS just can't handle that yet.
Mm-hmm. So we have 2 more questions, and another one just came in. If you have more questions, please feel free to type those in. So do the pods incorporate current fuel treatments? If not, why not?
They do. Well, yeah, so when we do all of our analysis for SDI, and SDI goes into PCLs, and all the fuel structure that comes out from those fuel treatments are in there. And we mine the FACTS database as we update it. So the Region 6 quantitative risk assessment, Joe Scott and his staff did that, and they worked through what was known or put into the FACTS database and integrated that into their fuels layers, and that's where it goes. And then now as we're moving, 1 year, 2 year post the development of that, we will update that ourselves, but it all comes from the FACTS database. And so it is dependent on the local units maintaining that database and uploading their accomplishments into it so that we can put it into what we have. The PCL, we could run it every year, and we might, particularly for an incident, but I think it has a little bit of a longer shelf life that we would like to see. It's maybe 5 years, and then we're producing SDI whenever it's needed, because it is more reflective of the fire behavior. It's easier to see that, and so when you use the 2 tools in conjunction with each other, it's easier to see. So yes, it's in there. It's in there based on the quality of data that's input in there and given to us, and then we'll update our databases as such.
Got it. So is there a standard that is used to help establish the NVC for the values of interest? If not, how are they established?
So there's a standard for Region 6 because there was one project for the whole region. And so that process really was about bringing in they didn't bring in everybody, of course, but bringing in the prominent stakeholders and discussing which values you want to address and then how they respond. And so that's a collaborative effort, primarily by Forest Service, ODF personnel, and DFPA and DNR personnel from Washington. And they sit around, and it's an expert judgment process to get there. So
okay.
That's the process, and it's standard for Region 6. But if you move to, in this case, it's standard for Region 6. If you move to a forest, just getting their QRA done, so quantitative risk assessment, say for the northern forests in California, the Six Rivers and Klamath and others, if they did their own, the values that go in there and how they're rated to fire and how is going to be a different group and a different decisions made, and it's going to be reflective of those local values and knowledge, and it could be fundamentally different than what we have here for Region 6 across. So standard in process, not standard in outcome, and we want it that way because we really want it to be reflective of what the local unit feels is important in their values.
Right. So I see the last question here. If you have any other questions, please get them in now. We just have a couple more minutes. Else you can always email Chris at chris.dunn@oregonstate.edu. But last question here, how is existing forest condition accounted for in the vegetation layers used in the models, like insect impacts?
Only in how they are played out in a field model, because that's how it plays out in the fire behavior simulations. And so there are some limitations to those field models and what they capture. So that's where it really shows up. And so that's the land fire data layers and their updates and their processes are extremely critical. Now, this question often comes up in relation to Suppression Difficulty Index, and right now that is just about exposure to fire and your ability to move on the landscape, which is a major issue and a major exposure to fire responders and fire personnel. But snags are a big issue. We just now, Kit and I in particular, have been working on trying to develop a responder exposure index, which would be different than Suppression Difficulty Index. It may integrate it where we're looking at that snag hazard and trying to map that snag hazard so that we can integrate that into this process so that we're further addressing concerns by the fire management community and the challenges they face. And snags are a big one of that. And then over time, snags become logs, and you start to see challenges in building fire line and operating that really impact the responder exposure. And so we have work to do on that front to get to those, and are actively pursuing it. I have a paper that Kit and I and others have a paper coming out in the next week or two that addresses the snag hazard and a method to map that. But we have a lot of work to do still.
So, Chris, just quickly to clarify, did you say a PCL map is good for about 5 years and the SDI is specific to individual fire starts?
I feel like we could ride the PCL out for a good 5 years. And that is in part because it's not as sensitive to that fire-on-fire interaction that we talked about. And until we can incorporate that, and we're trying to figure that out, then recent fire events aren't as they aren't going to change the overall probabilities too much. They will through SDI and maybe fire behavior estimates, but when you think about it in a relative sense, it's not going to show up that whole basin is all of a sudden a good control location just because there was a fire there, even though that's reflective of reality, just because we don't have the data available to model that or the process yet. That obviously will become more abundant over time as more and more fires are burning across landscapes, and we're going to try to integrate that to be reflective of that. And so I always think about, that's fine, that thing can, the PCL can stay stable much longer, but the SDI is easier to develop. We could probably do it in, under an hour for an entire forest, and it clearly shows recent fire history, and so I think it's important that we capture that. And then as of now, the fire managers need to look at both maps to account for that. And so I'd say PCL can stay for a while. It takes a lot more energy to create those, and SDI can be updated, and together they give you broader information.
Mm-hmm. Well, Chris, it is 20 after, and I want to be respectful of people's times. And just a quick couple of wrap-up things. First, to say thank you so much for this awesome presentation, and then your willingness to stay online with us to answer the questions. This was really helpful, and we appreciate you being online with us. I also want to thank everybody for taking the time out of your busy schedules to listen. And so the consortium provided today's webinar because we listened to your requests for webinars on this very topic of spatial planning. So when you exit out of this webinar, please take a minute to fill out our very short survey. The information you provide not only helps us to measure impact from the webinar, but it also informs us on what topics you're interested in for future webinars. So I'm going to thank you in advance for taking our very short 30-second survey. And with that, everybody have a great day, and thanks again, Chris, for your information this morning.
Thank you.
Thank you.